At the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills, California, in June of 1968, 300 people were gathered for a closed private screening of a new documentary on martial arts in cinema. The date was June 14th. The time was 8 o'clock in the evening. The air conditioning had been set so cold the marble floor seemed to reflect ice. In the fourth row, near the entrance to the projection room, sat a woman with high cheekbones and an athlete's posture, her hair pinned at the crown. She was Sanjay Roy, the former wife of Muhammad Ali, now a producer and cultural figure moving between the worlds of boxing and film. Beside her sat a man in his late 20s with shoulders that seemed too dense for a human frame. A martial artist whose name was becoming a particular kind of whisper in that city. Bruce Lee. 5'6", 135 pounds. A man who carried himself as though the air around him was his, not borrowed. He wore a pressed linen shirt and slacks. His hair was clean and cut close. Nothing about him suggested what would unfold in the next 74 seconds. Nobody in that hotel ballroom knew they were about to witness a reckoning. They would spend the next 6 decades telling it wrong. In the days before that evening, Sanjay Roy had been building her reputation as a voice in the emerging discipline of martial arts cinema. She had connections through Ali to the networks of strength and combat that shaped the counterculture of the moment. She had also become convinced, through conversations with several stunt coordinators and a few credentialed boxing figures, that the martial arts explosion in California was overblown. That there were men, real fighters, measured men, who trained in disciplines that would render Bruce Lee's movie work quaint. She did not yet understand the man she was sitting beside. That was the specific failure that would define the evening. The screening had ended at approximately 9:15. The crowd moved toward the foyer in the ceremonial shuffle of the semi-famous and the connected. Sanjay rose from her seat without hurry. She walked toward the projection room manager, a man named Victor Gaon, who had directed at least 100 studio films and trained in judo for 15 years. Victor had already placed his hand on Bruce Lee's shoulder as they stood talking. He was in mid-sentence when Sanjay approached. The conversation turned, as these conversations do in that world, to the question of whether martial arts training could produce a fighter who could stand against the infrastructure of American boxing. The real boxers, the professionals, the men who had fought men. Sanjay had been reflecting on this question for weeks. She had trained briefly in her youth. She had been around Ali long enough to understand the physics of speed and distance, and she had formed an opinion. She stated it not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone who believed she held accurate information. Film, she said to the small group, is not fighting. A man who trains for the camera is a different kind of man than a man who trains to be hit. Bruce is talented, but this is fantasy. The room did not change. The light continued to fall on the marble in the same way it had been falling. A waiter 3 tables away continued to clear glasses. No one moved. But the air had received information. The specific density of the moment, the conversation itself seemed to require restarting. Bruce Lee did not move his head. He did not shift his weight. He did not raise his voice. He was quiet in a way that suggested he was holding something in reserve, the way a reader holds back from turning a page because he knows what comes next will demand something from him. "You have trained," he said, a statement, not a question. He was looking at her directly now, not with anger, with an attention so complete that it seemed to make the rest of the room irrelevant. "Tell me, when you trained, what did you learn to do first?" Sanjay answered. "Stance, footwork, the basics, like everyone." "Yes," Bruce said, "everyone learns that first. Because everyone learns that way. And then everyone trains the way they have been taught to train. The method becomes the limit. The limit becomes the man." He stood then. Slowly, his hands hung at his sides, his shoulders seemed to widen as his posture shifted. What followed was not violence. What followed was demonstration. Victor would later tell the story this way, that Bruce moved so slowly, so deliberately, that every person in the room could see what he was doing. He covered the distance between himself and Sanjay, 6 feet, in the time it takes to blink. His hand rose and stopped 3 inches from her face. She had not moved. Could not move. The thing that had happened was so far outside the architecture of normal combat that her body had not received permission to react. "No stance," Bruce said quietly. His voice had not raised. No setup, no warning. Distance was the first technique. Before anything else. Before stance. Before footwork. The story a woman tells herself about what she has learned and what she can see while it is happening are two different stories. He stepped back. His hand returned to his side. He did not smile. He did not offer any gesture of apology or of continued threat. He simply returned to the conversation with Victor as though he had paused mid-sentence to check the time. Second 1. Bruce was standing at a natural distance from Sanji, roughly 6 feet. His weight was distributed across both feet with no visible bias toward his front leg or his rear. This is crucial. He was not in a fighting stance. He was standing as a man stands when he is standing. The distinction is the entirety of the lesson. His arms hung at his sides. There was no tension in his shoulders. The specific ease of his posture suggested someone waiting for a bus, not a man about to move faster than the eye could follow. Victor Gaon's face registered the distance first, the tournament director's instinct, even in a man trained only in judo, recognizes when a person has closed space without crossing it. The hotel manager, a man named Patricia Donnelly, who had worked security for studio events for 8 years, turned his head toward the pair. His coffee cup, which he had been holding at his chest, descended slowly to the side table. The sound was deliberate, audible, a small signature of his understanding that something had happened. Second 2. This is where the technique enters the story. Bruce's right hand rose in what looked, to the untrained eye, like a palm strike. But it was not a strike. It was a movement that covered distance and offered no commitment. His wrist was loose, his elbow was bent only slightly. The movement was so direct, straight line, no angle, no waste, that it seemed to tunnel through the space between them rather than cross it. Sanji could see his hand coming. She could see that clearly. Seeing and reacting are not the same capacity. A woman who is trained in basic forms can recognize a technique. A woman who is trained in basic forms cannot move faster than the biological speed of her own nervous system. The hand stopped. 3 inches from her face. Not 1 inch. Not 4. 3. That precision suggests control so refined that it cannot be accidental. Victor's both hands moved flat onto the table. The sound his palms made striking the marble seemed to clarify the moment for every person still watching. Second 3. The hand returned. Bruce's arm descended with the same controlled speed in which it had risen. Not faster, not slower. The physics of the movement, the economy of motion, the complete absence of wasted energy, suggested that this was not aggression. This was teaching. And a teaching delivered that precisely carries its own kind of authority. Sanji's face had not moved, her body had remained still. But her eyes, the specific shadow that had entered her expression, suggested that she had understood something in that second that she had not understood in the first. Patricia Donnelly, the security director, had risen from his chair. He made no movement toward the pair. He simply wanted to be standing. The decision itself was significant. A man trained to recognize escalation had recognized escalation even though nothing had escalated beyond the demonstration itself. A fight is not 2 men hitting each other. A fight is a negotiation about distance, about timing, and about whether one person can close space and control the terms of that closing before the other person can respond. A fight is the answer to a very specific question: who can make the rules in the interval between the challenger's decision to move and the defender's ability to react. Bruce Lee had answered that question without throwing a punch. Sanji Roy would spend the next 40 years thinking about those 74 seconds. The moment ended the way these moments do. Bruce stepped back. His hand returned to his side. He did not look at her with contempt or vindication. He looked at her with the absence of any particular expression, the way a man looks at a problem that has already been solved. He turned slightly toward Victor Gaon. His voice returned to its normal register, moderate and unhurried. "She will remember this," he said. "Not what she thinks she remembers, but what actually happened. Those are different things." Sanji Roy stood there. Her face had moved from shock into something more complex, not humiliation, but the recognition of a specific kind of education. She had been teaching people for years about how the body works and what it can do. She had believed, on the basis of the training she had done in her youth, that she understood the boundaries of human movement. In 74 seconds, those boundaries had been redrawn. The knowledge she carried in her body, the footwork, the stance, the basic forms she had learned and believed in, had been revealed as the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. It was the kind of knowledge that does not forgive. Once you know, you cannot unknow. She did not apologize. But she did not leave the conversation either. She asked a question. Will you teach? The words were quiet. Not deferential, but open in a way they had not been open before. The fork had presented itself. She could explain away what had happened, attribute it to lucky timing or physical circumstance. Or she could acknowledge that she had been standing at the edge of a technique so refined that it had seemed for a moment like magic. She chose the second path. That choice itself became the story. Bruce extended his hand. Not in violence, in greeting. The specific warmth of the gesture, the fact that he was offering her access rather than dismissal, made it clear that the confrontation had never been about diminishing her. It had been about revealing to her the scale of what she did not yet know. Sanji left the hotel that evening and called Muhammad Ali. She told him what had happened, but the telling was impossible. Language does not have a structure for this kind of narrative. She tried to describe the speed. Ali listened. He had spent his life studying footwork and distance. He understood, without seeing it, what she meant. That man, Ali said later, he is not doing what we do. He is showing us a different kind of language. The story spread through the martial arts community in Los Angeles like a current moving across water. But it spread incorrectly, the way stories do when they move through communities of men trying to maintain their own certainty. In some versions, Bruce had struck her, in others he had warned her to leave. In a third version, he had offered to train her on the condition that she leave Ali, a fabrication so complete it bears no resemblance to what happened. The original event, 74 seconds of controlled demonstration and precise teaching, mutated into a dozen different narratives, each one saying more about the person telling the story than about what actually occurred. Victor Gaon told the true version for decades. He would say, I saw something there that I did not understand, and I have been thinking about it ever since. He did not defeat her. He taught her something, and the teaching was so clear that she understood, on the spot, that she had been wrong about what a body could do. Patricia Donnelly, the security director, carried the story through the hotel system. It eventually reached Francis Ford Coppola, who was researching martial arts for a project he was developing. Coppola sat with Bruce Lee for 2 hours and asked only one question by the end: how did you close that distance? Bruce Lee's answer was simple: by understanding that distance is not something you travel through. Distance is something you negate. The moment you understand that principle, distance stops being an obstacle and becomes an invitation. Sanji Roy never spoke about the evening publicly, but she changed her work in subtle ways. She began commissioning documentaries that took martial arts seriously, not as spectacle, but as a discipline as refined as classical ballet or concert music. She produced a film about the philosophical foundations of Kung Fu, which was made but never widely distributed. She trained privately with a master who had trained Bruce Lee. She became, in her own way, a keeper of what happened that evening. The light in the Beverly Wilshire ballroom continued to fall on the marble floor, indifferent to the reckoning it had witnessed. The hotel manager closed the projection room at 10 o'clock. The chairs were pushed into neat rows. The documentary was locked away. By the next morning, no trace of the evening remained except in the specific people who had been there and in the stories they would carry and malform and preserve and misremember for the rest of their lives. This much is true. Bruce Lee left the Beverly Wilshire that evening the same way he had arrived: quiet, unremarkable to look at, underdressed by the standards of the space. He did not sign autographs. He did not acknowledge the significance of what had happened. He simply walked toward the car, opened the door, and sat in the driver's seat. His hands on the steering wheel were the hands of a man who had just had a conversation, not the hands of a man who had just finished a fight. The difference is precisely the point. Sanji Roy would outlive him by more than 40 years. When she was interviewed late in her life, she was asked if she regretted the exchange. She said, I regret the ignorance I brought to that moment. I do not regret the education. It is the most honest thing that any person from that evening ever said about what happened. The specific architecture of skill is built from this kind of teaching, not from the humiliation of an opponent, but from the precise demonstration that the opponent's map of the world was smaller than the world itself. A woman who has trained in the basics can become a woman who understands that the basics are merely an introduction. Understanding that distinction is the beginning of actual knowledge. Bruce Lee gave Sanji Roy that understanding in 74 seconds, without anger, without raised voices, without the performance of triumph. He simply showed her what was possible when a person understood distance not as an obstacle but as a language. The story has lived for 58 years in the spaces between memory and myth. The truth of it, the precision, the absence of cruelty, the absolute clarity of the teaching, has been buried under versions that simplified it into conflict. But in this place, in this moment, the original event is being restored, not from documents or footage, which do not exist, but from the testimony of men who were there and whose understanding of what they saw was refined enough to preserve not the fiction but the fact. The fact is this: a woman challenged an idea. A man answered not with anger but with information. The information changed everything.